The sun had barely begun to rise when I first approached the edge of the forgotten cemetery. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around the broken tombstones like ghostly fingers reaching out to pull me into the earth. Every step I took on the cracked path echoed unnaturally, as if the silence itself was listening, waiting. For years the locals had avoided this place, muttering warnings under their breath about those who had entered and never returned. Curiosity, as it often does, overcame caution, and I found myself stepping past the rusted iron gates, the hinges groaning in protest. The cemetery was unlike any I had ever seen. Tombstones leaned at impossible angles, some half buried in soil thick with moss, others cracked and worn so that the inscriptions were nearly illegible. Names from centuries past stared back at me, etched in stone with a permanence that defied the creeping decay. It was not merely the age of the place that unsettled me. It was the palpable sense of waiting, of lives paused mid-story, their secrets sealed beneath layers of earth and shadow. As I walked deeper, a faint, almost imperceptible sound brushed against my ears, the soft shuffle of footsteps that weren't my own. I paused, straining to listen, but the wind swept the sound away, leaving only silence and the distant crowing of a solitary crow perched atop a leaning obelisk. My heart began to beat faster, a steady drum of warning, yet I pressed forward, drawn by the inexplicable feeling that something within the cemetery wanted to be found. Among the tombstones, there were signs that this place had not been entirely abandoned. Offerings, flowers blackened with age, tattered ribbons fluttering from crooked crosses hinted at someone or something tending the graves in secret. I wondered who would risk entering this place, and why the locals spoke of it only in hushed tones. One name caught my eye, a gravestone worn smooth by time, yet still legible enough to read the words, Eleanor Whitmore disappeared, 1864. Disappeared. The word itself seemed to thrum in the air, vibrating with an unseen power. I moved closer, brushing the moss aside, and felt the chill of the stone seep into my fingers. There were more, dozens, perhaps hundreds of names etched with the same haunting word. The cemetery was a record of the forgotten, a ledger of those who had vanished without a trace, and yet there was no marker, no record outside these gates to explain what had happened. It was as if history itself had chosen to forget them. The deeper I walked, the more the air changed. It became heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, mingled with something indefinably metallic, like blood long dried. Shadows pooled between the gravestones, shifting as if alive, flickering at the corner of my vision. I could have sworn I saw movement, a figure flitting between the stones, but when I turned fully, there was nothing, just the mist, curling and writhing like the restless spirits that were said to linger here. Variant of the cemetery, I found a small, unmarked grave, so new it seemed impossible to belong alongside the centuries of decay surrounding it. The soil was dark, freshly turned, and the air above it shimmered with an unnatural cold. I knelt, running my fingers over the dirt, and something pricked at the back of my mind, a whisper I could not understand. "Do not disturb us," it seemed to say. Yet my curiosity burned stronger than fear, and I could not leave. As the sun climbed higher, faint rays struggled through the fog, illuminating a path that had not been there moments before. I realized then that the cemetery was alive in ways that defied logic. Paths twisted and shifted subtly, graves seemed to move if you glanced away, and the shadows between the stones stretched and reached, always just beyond my sight. Every step forward was a step deeper into a story. The world had tried to forget a story written in whispers, in stone, and in the very air itself. By the time I reached the oldest section, where the first settlers of the town had been laid to rest, I felt the weight of the cemetery pressing down upon me. Here, the tombstones were massive, leaning monuments to families long gone, yet everyone bore the same haunting inscription, disappeared. The repetition was maddening, a pattern that suggested design rather than chance. It was no longer a place of mourning, it was a record of disappearance, a catalogue of lives stolen from memory. A sudden gust of wind rattled the iron gates, and I jumped, heart pounding. It was as if the cemetery had finally noticed me, as if it had been waiting for someone to bear witness. I could feel eyes upon me, though no one was there. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into words just beyond comprehension, brushing against the edges of my mind. All find, uncover, beware. I spent hours wandering, taking notes, photographing the stones, trying to document what I could before the sun fully rose and the mist burned away. Every corner held another secret, another hint at the lives that had once walked these paths. And yet, even as I documented, I realized that no matter how much I captured, the cemetery held more than I could ever know. Its secrets were vast, layered like the soil under which the missing rested, waiting for those foolish or brave enough to seek them. By the time I finally stepped back through the rusted gates, the mist had begun to dissipate, and the cemetery looked almost ordinary in the morning light. Yet I knew the truth. The forgotten cemetery was a living memory of those who had vanished, and it had allowed me to witness only the smallest fraction of its story. What else lay buried beneath the stones? What forces lingered in the shadows I could only imagine? One thing was certain. These were secrets that the world had tried to forget, and for a fleeting moment I had glimpsed them, and I knew with a chill that settled in my bones that the forgotten cemetery had not finished with me yet. Before the iron gates rusted and the paths twisted into obscurity, this land had a name. It appeared briefly in old county maps, written in fading ink, then vanished from records entirely, as if someone had deliberately erased it. The town that once surrounded the cemetery thrived quietly, built by hands that history rarely mentions and voices that were never allowed to speak freely. I began my research in the local archives, a narrow building tucked between a closed post office and a boarded-up church. Dust coated every surface. The air smelled of paper and neglect. An elderly clerk watched me closely as I requested documents related to the cemetery. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough for me to notice. "Those records are incomplete," she said. Most of them always were. What she handed me was a thin folder, too thin for a place that had existed for over a century. Inside were fragmented burial logs, census lists with names scratched out, and pages that ended mid-sentence. Entire years were missing. Where dates should have been, there were blank spaces. Where causes of death should have been listed, there was only a single repeated phrase written in different handwriting styles: unconfirmed absence. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the cemetery was never meant to be remembered, only used. Historical accounts revealed that the land originally served as a burial ground for those the town did not wish to acknowledge: laborers, freed individuals, migrants, and people who lived on the margins of society. Officially, they were transient. Unofficially, they were expendable. One journal, dated 1863, belonged to a school teacher who had lived near the cemetery. Her handwriting trembled as the entries progressed. They bury them quietly now. No services, no names spoken aloud. The ground receives them, and the town pretends nothing happened. Another entry followed only weeks later. People are disappearing, not dying, vanishing, and the cemetery grows. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every decade, disappearances spiked. Entire families vanished from census records. Houses stood empty overnight. No investigations were launched. No newspapers reported the events in detail, only vague mentions of relocation or departure. But no destination was ever listed. What disturbed me most was a set of hand-drawn maps tucked inside the journal's back cover. They showed the cemetery expanding over time, not outward, but inward. Graves layered atop graves, older headstones removed, replaced with new ones bearing no names. The past wasn't being preserved, it was being overwritten. I returned to the cemetery with this knowledge weighing heavily on me. The place felt different now, not merely haunted, but complicit. The tombstones were no longer passive markers of death. They were evidence. In the older section, I noticed symbols carved into several stones, marks I had dismissed earlier as decorative damage. Now I recognized their repetition. Circles intersected by vertical lines. Triangular etchings filled with ash, symbols that appeared in no religious texts but showed up frequently in marginal historical records associated with secrecy and containment. One stone, half sunken into the earth, bore a warning rather than a name. Let them remain. The town's oral history, when spoken at all, contradicted the records. Locals spoke of night wagons that moved silently through the streets after midnight, of bells that rang only once, then never again, of a rule unwritten but strictly followed that no one was to visit the cemetery alone. Those who did were said to return changed, or not return at all. I interviewed a man whose great-grandfather had served as a groundskeeper. He refused to be recorded. His hands shook as he spoke. They didn't bury people there because they were dead, he said. They buried them so they wouldn't come back. When I pressed him to explain, he ended the conversation abruptly, warning me to leave the town before nightfall. As I pieced together the fragments, a grim theory emerged. The cemetery was not merely a resting place, it was a solution. A place designed to absorb what the town could not control, whether through fear, violence, or something darker. People were being removed from existence and absorbed into the ground itself. And the cemetery remembered them all. One final document confirmed my suspicion. A sealed council meeting transcript, dated 1891, ended with a single chilling resolution. For the preservation of order, certain matters must remain unacknowledged. The ground will keep what the records cannot. Standing among the graves again, I felt the truth settle like a weight in my chest. This was not a forgotten cemetery by accident, it was forgotten by design. And whatever had been buried there, whatever secrets lay beneath the soil, had never truly been gone. The first night, after uncovering the cemetery's hidden past, I didn't return home. Something told me not to. The town felt different once the sun dipped below the horizon. Streets that had seemed merely abandoned during the day now felt alert, watchful. Porch lights flickered on and off, not because someone was home, but because no one was. Curtains moved where no wind could reach. Dogs howled from behind locked doors, then fell silent all at once, as if commanded. I returned to the cemetery just before midnight. The gates were already open. I was certain I had closed them earlier. I remembered the sound of rusted iron grinding against itself, the weight of the metal as I forced it shut. Yet, there they were now, wide enough for someone or something to pass through. The mist had returned thicker than before. It clung to my ankles, cold and heavy, like water that refused to drip away. My flashlight beam cut through it in narrow tunnels, illuminating fragments of stone and shadow, but never the full picture. The cemetery no longer felt like a place, it felt like a presence. I had the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. As I stepped inside, the air changed instantly. My breath fogged unnaturally fast, and a sharp pressure settled behind my eyes, like a warning headache. Every instinct told me to leave, but something stronger and unseen urged me forward, deeper into the rows of graves. That was when I heard it. A whisper, not carried by the wind, not imagined. It came from directly behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. But the whisper came again, closer this time. Not words, just the sound of breath shaped by intent. The kind of sound someone makes when they are trying not to be heard. I moved faster. The tombstones began to look wrong, not broken, shifted. Graves I remembered passing earlier appeared again ahead of me, as if the paths were looping back on themselves. The ground sloped in places it hadn't before. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, bending against the direction of my light. Then I noticed the footprints. They appeared in the soft soil beside mine, bare, human, and fresh. But I was alone. My pulse thundered in my ears as I followed them despite myself. They led toward the unmarked grave I'd found earlier, the one with freshly turned soil. Only now the earth was disturbed again, sunken slightly inward, as if something beneath it had shifted. A low vibration hummed through the ground. I knelt despite the fear screaming in my chest. The soil was warm. That should not have been possible. Suddenly the whispers multiplied. Dozens of them overlapped, forming a low, unintelligible murmur that pressed against my skull. Images flooded my mind, faces without eyes, mouths opening in silent screams, hands clawing upward through darkness. I staggered back, gasping. That was when I saw them. Figures stood between the graves. They did not move like people. They did not walk. They simply appeared, one moment absent, the next fully present. Their forms were incomplete, edges blurring into the fog, faces indistinct as if unfinished. Yet I knew what they were, not ghosts in the traditional sense. They felt unfinished. One figure stood closer than the rest. It tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, as if studying me. When it raised its arm, I saw markings carved into its skin, symbols identical to those etched into the tombstones. Understanding hit me like ice water. These were not souls at rest. They were records, memories trapped without resolution. The whisper sharpened into fragments of language, unmarked, unspoken, kept. I backed away until my heel struck stone. I fell hard. The breath knocked from my lungs. My flashlight skidded across the ground, spinning wildly and casting the figures into stuttering motion. In those flashes I saw more. Faces I recognized from the burial lobes. Names scratched out of census records. Children, families, people who had not died but had been removed. The cemetery wasn't haunted, it was occupied, and it was active. A sudden pressure closed around my chest, pinning me in place. The figures leaned closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Images poured into my mind again: night wagons, blindfolds, forced marches through fog, soil closing overhead. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to be remembered. The pressure released as suddenly as it began. The figures recoiled, melting back into the mist as a deep bell tolled somewhere beneath the ground. Not loud felt. A signal. The ground trembled. Graves shifted. Somewhere nearby a stone cracked. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I crossed the gates and collapsed onto the road beyond. When I finally dared to turn, the cemetery stood silent, once more still. Empty, almost peaceful. Too peaceful. Back at my lodging, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched, reflected in the dark window. I thought I saw shapes moving behind me. At one point, I noticed dirt beneath my fingernails, dark soil I did not remember touching. In the mirror, faint markings traced my wrist. They were already fading. By morning, they were gone. But something else remained. I had brought part of the cemetery with me. The whispers didn't stop after that night. They followed me in dreams, in reflections, in the quiet spaces between sounds. They didn't demand fear anymore. They demanded truth. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the unseen forces bound to that forgotten cemetery were not finished. They had waited generations. And now, they had found someone who could hear them. After that night, fear was no longer the strongest emotion I felt. It was urgency. The whispers had changed. They no longer circled me like distant echoes. They guided me, pushed me toward fragments of truth, scattered across the town like bones buried too shallow to stay hidden forever. Whatever the cemetery was, whatever it held, it was clear now that it wanted to be understood before it was silenced again. I began where records ended. The town hall basement had been locked for years, officially condemned due to structural instability. Unofficially, everyone knew it was avoided for other reasons. I broke in just before dawn, using a rusted side door that no one had bothered to secure. The air below was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and old ink. Filing cabinets lined the walls, most empty, some forcibly pried open. But a single cabinet remained untouched. Inside were maps, not burial maps, movement maps. They documented paths taken through the town at night, routes marked with dates, initials, and symbols I now recognized from the cemetery stones. Each route ended in the same place, the forgotten cemetery. Beside the maps were lists, not names, numbers, grouped in 10s and 20s, no explanations, no outcomes, just tallies. Someone had been keeping count. I photographed everything. That was my first mistake. When I emerged from the basement, someone was waiting across the street, a man I hadn't seen before, or perhaps one I had failed to notice until now. He stood perfectly still, pretending to read a notice board that had been empty for years. When I raised my camera, he walked away. Slowly. Too calmly. From that moment on, the town closed itself to me. Doors that had once opened now stayed shut. Calls went unanswered. The archive clerk refused to meet my eyes. Even the man who had spoken of the groundskeeper lineage left town abruptly, his house emptied overnight. Someone knew what I was doing, and they were watching closely. That night I followed the whispers again, but this time they led me not into the cemetery, but beneath it. Hidden behind an ivy-covered mausoleum, I found a stone slab with faint grooves along its edges. It wasn't decorative. It was functional. With effort and no small amount of fear, I slid it aside. A stairwell descended into darkness. The air that rose from below was warmer than it should have been, carrying the unmistakable scent of earth long sealed away. My flashlight revealed walls carved directly into bedrock, marked with the same symbols I had seen everywhere else. This was no burial extension. It was a chamber. At the bottom I found what records could not erase. Rows of niches lined the walls, not coffins, but restraints. Iron fixtures embedded into stone, chains rusted from long disuse. Scratches marred the surfaces around them, deep and frantic. People had been held here, not buried, processed. In the center of the chamber stood a ledger carved into stone. Names had once been etched into its surface, then deliberately chiseled away. Whoever removed them hadn't rushed. The erasures were careful, thorough. But they had missed something. Under ultraviolet light, faint impressions remained. Pressed too deeply into the stone to be fully destroyed, names surfaced, so did dates, so did repetitions. Entire bloodlines appeared, disappearing every few generations, always around the same years, always coinciding with periods of social unrest, economic collapse, or political change. The town hadn't reacted to chaos. It had prepared for it. As I documented the chamber, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged. The whispers returned, not frantic now, but focused. Below. More. Behind the ledger, a concealed passage opened into a deeper vault. This one was different. The walls were smoother. The floor stained dark. At its center lay a pit, not deep, but wide. Surrounding it were symbols arranged in a circle, worn by time but unmistakably intentional. This was not a holding area. It was a termination point. I understood then why no bodies had ever been found. There had been nothing left to find. A sound echoed above footsteps on stone. Someone else was in the cemetery. I extinguished my light and pressed myself into the shadows as voices drifted down the stairwell. Low, controlled, familiar, town officials. Not ghosts, not cultists, caretakers. We told them to stop digging, one voice said. They always dig, another replied. That's why the ground exists. Flashlight beams swept across the chamber. I held my breath as they passed inches from my hiding place. They examined the ledger, the pit, the restraints, not with horror but with routine. Maintenance. When they left, sealing the chamber behind them, I remained frozen long after the silence returned. Because the whispers had stopped. And in their place was something worse. Approval. As I emerged hours later, dawn breaking weakly over the cemetery, I knew two things with absolute certainty. The town had not forgotten the cemetery. It had depended on it, and now that I had seen what lay beneath, the cemetery would not let me leave without consequence. Because investigations uncover truth. But truth demands witnesses, and witnesses rarely survive long in places built to erase them. I did not leave the town immediately. That was my second mistake. After discovering what lay beneath the cemetery, logic told me to run, to take the evidence, expose everything, and never look back. But logic had very little power here. The moment I crossed the gates that morning, I understood something fundamental. The cemetery was not bound to the land. It was bound to the town. And now, somehow, it was bound to me. The whispers returned that night, but softer than before. No longer desperate, no longer pleading. They were patient. I tried to compile the evidence. Photos corrupted themselves, files that should have existed opened as blank images. Audio recordings captured only static, except for a low, rhythmic sound beneath it, like breathing. Written notes blurred where names should have been, ink bleeding, as if the paper itself rejected them. It was as if the truth resisted being carried away. When I attempted to leave town the next morning, my car wouldn't start. The mechanic claimed nothing was wrong. The engine simply refused to turn over whenever I sat behind the wheel. "You'll get it running," he said calmly. "Everyone does. Eventually." That word lingered. Eventually, I returned to the cemetery one last time, not because I wanted to, but because something inside me knew this was where the story ended. The gates opened without resistance. The mist welcomed me like an old acquaintance. The figures were waiting, not hidden this time, not half-formed. They stood clearly among the graves, faces visible now. Ordinary faces, tired, patient. Some bore expressions of relief, others resignation. They did not approach. They made space. At the center of the cemetery, the ground shifted. Stone ground against stone as a grave I had never seen before rose slowly from the earth. Its surface was smooth, unmarked until letters began to appear, carved as if by invisible hands. Not a name, a row, witness. Understanding came with crushing clarity. The town had always needed the cemetery, and the cemetery had always needed someone to remember, not to save the dead, but to hold them, to carry the memory forward when records failed, when history erased. That was the true function of the disappearances. Not sacrifice, containment. Each generation, someone uncovered too much, someone who saw the patterns, someone who listened too closely. They did not die. They stayed, as living memory, as anchors. I felt the earth pull at my feet, not violently, but insistently, like a tide. The whispers gathered into a single voice, calm and final. "You see us. You know. Remain." For a moment I considered fighting it, but then I understood what would happen if I didn't. The town would continue. The system would reset. New names would vanish. New graves would fill. And no one would remember why. Fear gave way to something colder. Responsibility. When I placed my hand against the stone, the cemetery exhaled. The pressure lifted. The figures faded, settling back into the ground. Not gone, but held. The grave sealed itself. Morning came quietly. The town looked unchanged. Birds sang. Doors opened. Life resumed its careful rhythm. No one acknowledged me as I walked through the streets. Not avoidance. Acceptance. I am still here. I no longer try to leave. At night, I walk the cemetery paths, correcting stones that tilt too far, clearing moss from names that must not vanish completely. I feel the whispers, but they no longer overwhelm me. They trust me now. The archives will never show what happened here. Investigations will stall. Outsiders will feel uneasy and move on. And that is the point. Because the truth was never meant to escape. It was meant to be kept, buried, preserved. If you ever pass through a town that feels too quiet, where the cemetery is older than the buildings around it, do not linger. And if you hear whispers beneath your feet, do not listen too closely. Some secrets are buried not because they are dead, but because they are still watching. The forgotten cemetery was never just a burial ground. It was a system, a solution, a living archive built not to honor the dead but to erase them. What began as disappearances slowly revealed itself as something far more deliberate. The town did not lose its people, it gave them away. When records failed and history became inconvenient, the cemetery absorbed what could not be explained, controlled, or allowed to return. The dead were never at rest, because they were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to be contained. Through the shadows, the whispers, and the hidden chambers beneath the soil, one truth became clear. This place did not feed on death, it fed on silence. Each generation repeated the same cycle, sacrificing memory for order, truth for stability. And when someone uncovered too much, when a witness finally listened closely enough, the cemetery did not destroy them, it kept them. Because some horrors cannot be buried with soil alone. They require someone to stay behind, to remember. The town still exists, the cemetery still stands, and the secrets are still there, intact, patient, breathing beneath the ground. So if you ever come across a place that feels forgotten by design, where names vanish and history feels incomplete, do not ask what was lost. Ask who stayed behind, because some truths are never meant to be found, they are meant to be guarded.